See, my name's Mike Unsworth. I've been retired from MSU since 2016. I was the history librarian there. Before that, I worked at Notre Dame for about 5 years, and then at Colorado State. Got a bachelor's in history, a master's in library science, and a master's in nonprofit administration. One thing I like to do is historical research. This is the third time I've been here, and I think they want me to come back and repeat my Japanese balloon attack deal, because I gave that talk like 15 years ago, and as you know, there's been some other things. Now, over 20 years ago, I gave this same talk to the Michigan Historical Society in conjunction with an article I wrote in Michigan History Magazine. Okay. But the research I had to do re-over because there is so much more photographs now on the web. This was the pre-internet days when I did the research, and you'll see the result of that. Okay, so why am I talking about President Ford's World War II time? Well, first of all, I think it's an interesting story, and I hope you guys think also. And his service was intimately connected with the key technology, aviation, so it suits this museum. And then finally, his experience had an impact on him as a legislator. Too many wires in this modern world of ours. Had an impact on him as a legislator and then as president. Okay, here, my sister, who's a high school teacher, saying, Mike, you always have to start with a joke. I don't have any jokes. Well, okay. I think everybody here lived when Ford was president, right? Well, it doesn't matter. It's good. It's good. But when he was minority leader of the House, do you guys remember what Lyndon Johnson said about him? Oh, problem with Jerry Ford is that he played too much football without a helmet. There's the joke. And that's Lyndon Johnson, who got a Silver Star in World War II under very dicey circumstances. Somebody should come and give a lecture about that. But it's not going to be me. But anyway, I was a high school debater. They say you got to tell them what you're going to say. So I'm going to talk about his pre-war time very briefly. He joins the Navy, he goes through training, he becomes an instructor, goes afloat on the USS Monterey, and I'm taking particular attention with the Battle of the Philippine Seas, and then something known as Halsey's Typhoon. Who's seen the Caine Mutiny movie? Way back when, yeah. Way back when, okay, I'm a big movie buff, but that plays a role in the Caine Mutiny movie. Then he goes back ashore, and significant incident was the Duke versus Naval Academy football game, if you can believe that. Brief summary, and then I'm going to talk about the latest Navy aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford. Okay, by December of '41, Ford was on his way for his adult career. He graduated from the U of M. As you see in the upper left, he played football. He also was a pretty good student. And he turned down offers from the NFL, the Packers and the Lions. Well, back then with the NFL, you had to have a day job. So he decided he was going to coach at Yale. And he started part-time in the law school, then full-time, graduated in the top third of his class, went back to Grand Rapids, and with a friend, they hung up a shingle in late '41. Well, Pearl Harbor put an end to that for him and for about everybody else's plans. He quickly volunteered for the Navy, and from that point on, his life was subsumed to the needs of the sea service. And I'm going to go back from what's happening to Jerry and then overall why this is happening to Jerry and vice versa. The first thing is training. Could you maybe get that to focus a little better on the image? Chris? Or is it, no, I think it's my glasses.
First class video. 4 years. There you go, that's good.
Okay, very good. And what's his specialty?
You recognized it? What was his rank?
Well, not his rank.
It's a first class.
And what's his specialty? He's a medical corpsman. If you look real closely, okay, if you look below the eagle, it's a red cross.
Okay.
And that's the 1st Marine Division patch on him. When does the museum shut down? My talk is an hour, but I could go on. Anyway, he was a medical corpsman with the Marines at Guadalcanal on that. Okay. Stepping backwards, we have to train a Navy for a world war. In 1941, the Navy had 284,000 sailors. By the end of the war, it had 3.3 million. So, and the Army was the same way. And actually, before Pearl Harbor, the Navy was almost equal to the Army in terms of enlistments. The Army at that time, they were just behind Portugal in terms of men under arms. Okay. So you had to, have a 2-ocean Navy. You had to fight on 2 fronts, and you needed people for it. For the enlisted people, it was 68 weeks of basic training. And when that was done, 50% of those boots were sent to trade or specialty schools. The rest of them were sent to the fleet. And when I say the fleet, I often mean the shore stations too. And they had on-the-job training. Specialty training on the lower right, you have radio. And then on the left, seaman is learning how to operate a motion picture camera. I included that because on aircraft carriers, they had both still and motion picture photographers film every takeoff and landing. That's for training and then accident investigation, or more appropriately, crash investigations.
So they had training for over a year?
It depended on the specialty school. The boot camp is 6 to 8 weeks.
Okay.
I know that for Japanese language training it was over a year, but I think that was just for officers. Okay. Officers training is a bit different. When things got really ramped up, it was 3 months, hence the term 90-day wonders. Ford enlisted early, right after Pearl Harbor. He was inducted in the Navy in April of '42 as an ensign. Are people familiar with Navy ranks?
No.
Okay. An ensign is equivalent to a first lieutenant in the Army and the Marines. And whenever I say Army and the rest of this, I'm including the Marines. Okay, it's just one last thing to say. Ford came in April '42 as an ensign, equivalent to a second lieutenant. He goes through a 1-month-long training course at Annapolis at the Naval Academy. And when he's done for that, he is promoted to lieutenant junior grade, which is the equivalent of an Army first lieutenant. I think the people on the bottom right are learning intelligence work. Ford wanted to get into naval intelligence, but he was not selected. And a friend of his said, well, with all of your athletic background, the Navy is looking for physical fitness instructors for their V5 pilot training. And so Ford semi-accidentally gets involved with naval aviation for the rest of his time in the Navy. Now, there's a common misperception, especially on television documentaries, that the Navy only embraced airplanes after Pearl Harbor when the battleships all got blown up. That is not the case. The Navy really got into the airplane business starting with World War I and through the interwar period. And as an indication for that, a year and a half before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Congress passes the Two Ocean Navy Act. And what does that entail? Among other things, authorizing 18 aircraft carriers, 15,000 naval aircraft, and of course you need the people to fly them. So this was not a Johnny-come-lately, our backs to the wall, we'll try this is all that's left. No, naval aviation was working its way through the Navy's infrastructure. I do like the background. That is the tower for a Pennsylvania-class battleship, not an aircraft carrier. So I think the artist probably included that because it looked cool. But I find that interesting. Okay, Navy pilot training. As this illustrates, the first row, basic military stuff, some physical fitness and athletics, and then training on whatever aircraft you're going to be flying. Now, for aviation training in the Navy, an essential part was athletics. And there's 3 reasons for that. First one is obvious, physical condition. Second one, you want to inculcate in people an aggressive attitude. Even if you're like a transport pilot, you have to be concerned about the mission. And then thirdly, inculcate teamwork. Despite what Hollywood likes to show, is they don't want a lot of mavericks running around in uniform. They want everybody pulling together. And the Navy had several D5 preflight programs around big universities and colleges that had good facilities. Ford was sent to the University of North Carolina, which is in Durham. Thing I like about the poster on the right is that it pretty much symbolizes what the Navy viewed athletics from. You know, football is part of becoming a successful, in this case, I think it's a dive bombing airplane. At UNC, Ford taught elementary navigation skills, ordnance, gunnery, first aid, and military drill. That was half his time. The other half, he coached all 9 sports that were offered, but mostly swimming, boxing, and football. And during his year at pre-flight school, he was promoted to full lieutenant, which is equivalent to an Army captain, in March of '43. Now, Ford could have spent the entire war at the Raleigh-Durham area. He was the type of guy, I think he had a lot of good connections. He could have stayed being an instructor. The guys on the lower right are instructors. But he wanted a more active part in the war. So he lobbied for that, and he was assigned to the Independence class carrier USS Monterey. Now, back then, before politics got involved in ship naming, the Navy liked to name its aircraft carriers for either historic ships or for victories in U.S. military history. Okay, the Monterey was named for a Mexican-American war battle in Monterey, California. Here Marines are landing from whaleboats. And this was an anomaly. This was a bloodless victory. The Mexicans surrendered when the troops were landed. But the Navy goes, hey, there's a victory, we're going to name this ship for it. Okay, what makes independent class carriers unique is that they were not designed from the keel up to be aircraft carriers. They were the hulls of cruisers, heavy cruisers that were being built. Why did they do this? Well, they were insurance in case the exit. Do you have a question now? Oh, I guess, oh. Class carriers were delayed. Well, what pray tell is an Essex class carrier? It's the mainstay, planned mainstay of the U.S. fleet. They were fast. They went 33 knots, which is equivalent of 38 miles per hour. Most of the battleships in the Navy at that time went maybe 25 knots. They carried 90 to 105 planes, and to run the ship, you had about a little over 320 officers, 3,300 enlisted sailors. The carriers had top priority in construction, and fortunately construction went quicker than expected. 17 were completed by war's end, 14 saw combat, and while, let's see here, that's not going to work. Okay, I hope I remember this. While they were overcrowded, they had a large air group and high speed and could take a lot of damage. So these were the keys to the Navy, but important people, namely Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, he was a Navy nut. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I, like his cousin Theodore prior to that. And Roosevelt thought, well, let's make sure we have some backup in case the Essex class carriers get delayed. And the Navy goes, okay, we'll take these Cleveland class hulls. They were the smallest hulls that were suitable for carrier conversion. They had a speed of 31 knots, so they could pretty much keep up with the Essex class carriers. They had some limitations. They were narrow, which constrained the flight decks and the hangar area. And oh boy, some of my text here doesn't show up well. Anyway, I'll wing it. Okay, is this? No. Okay. It's probably this. Can anybody see the laser pointer? All right. Okay.
There's a pointer on the left.
On
Left of the fireplace is a pointer.
fireplace? Oh.
Actually, I think it's acoustic.
Okay, you guys see that. Oh, that's even better. Okay. Thank you. Okay, if you notice the cruiser hull, narrower than a Essex carrier. Along the sides of the flight deck is a metal ridge, and below it you have a catwalk. A very small island where the bridge is. And also a crane for quickly moving aircraft or lifting it up from the docks. And you have, instead of one smokestack, 4 for each boiler. Again, this was due to the cruiser design. They wanted to have as much room as possible for the flight deck, so they didn't put the smokestack there, they put it according to the size. And this was probably the most successful conversion of World War II. Some other nations tried it, but it didn't work as well. Okay. It carried roughly 30 planes. I'll get into those in a minute. But from the bottom, you see the 2 ships' elevators, one forward, one to the rear. Okay. The 9 ships in this class that were built in under 2 years had a capacity of 4 Essex class carriers. The small decks had a higher accident rate, increased vulnerability to damage, and uncomfortable crew quarters. The crew was about 1,500. Now what happened during the war for all ships is they got heavier. more equipment put on, especially more anti-aircraft guns. And so the crew got bigger too, to service everything. Okay, for defensive armament, they only had two kind of weapons. These are automatic cannon on the left, 40 millimeter Bofors guns. They were effective up to 3,000 yards. And then 20 millimeter Oerlikon guns. They were effective to about 1,500 yards. Those don't sound like American companies, Beaufort and Oerlikon. And they're not. Beaufort was a Swedish company. Oerlikon was a Swiss company. During the interwar period, these were excellent designs, and so these two nations licensed construction of these weapons to all comers. And so the German Navy had both of these weapons. On that. Oh yeah, the guys on the right are messmen, because back then the Navy was segregated. The only non-white jobs were for the gallery, for the mess. Okay. The reason for an aircraft carrier, of course, is to fly aircraft. And there were two types, the Grumman F6S Hellcat. Single seat, folding wings. You'll see that a little better in the next slide. Here's where it's mission, something called combat air patrol. The planes would be launched, they would circle the fleet, and they would intercept any intruders. The Navy really embraced radar. The British developed it first. Since we were buddies, they gave us the technology and we ran with it. Also, they could participate in what's called fighter sweeps of defended anchorages and other facilities. They could escort bombers. They could machine gun, bomb, and rocket surface targets. And then, not very efficiently, they could do anti-submarine patrol. The aircraft, according to a Navy report, could outclimb, outturn, and outdive Japanese planes. Okay, the next aircraft that was on board, this was about maybe a quarter of the strength of the Avengers, of the Hellcats, was the Avenger. It was designed and built by Grumman, but it was also built by General Motors in the New Jersey plant. It had a number of missions also, torpedo and bombing. I can't see the laser. Anyway, if you notice that underneath the fuselage, there is a bomb bay. That's where the bombs and torpedoes were kept. They did very effectively anti-submarine patrol. They also did reconnaissance. They had a good range. Like the Hellcat, they could fit rockets underneath the wings. And you notice how the wings are folded. Grumman liked to fold the wings that way. Instead of going straight up, they pivoted to the sides. And one thing I learned in researching this, they did mine laying. Okay, one author says the Avenger was a rugged and stable aircraft, well equipped with good handling and a long range. Okay, aircraft carriers take landing and taking off, give a lot of punishment to an airframe. And Grumman made its planes tough. And I'll take a little more look at that in a minute. So, Ford is assigned to the Monterey. And he boarded the ship in May of 1943, where it was being completed at the New York Shipbuilding Company in Camden, New Jersey. That's opposite Philadelphia on the Delaware River. This facility built all 9 Independence-class carriers. As I said, these were crammed ships. This is from the Yorktown, but it gives an indication of what it was like on an Independence-class carrier. Here's what the listed sailors had. The officers had better accommodations. Better is a relative term. Ford was in a two-man berth, and he shared it with the ship's chaplain. Okay, his initial assignment was with the 2nd Division. It was responsible for 2 junior officers and other enlisted sailors. Excuse me. That's roughly comparable to an Army company. His duties were drafting and monitoring procedures and supervising the officers and the chief petty officers. Those are like senior sergeants. His deck division, his was a deck division which handled lines for anchoring, mooring, and fueling at sea. At general quarters, his station was in the rear of the vessel where that greenish circle is. That is a quad 40 millimeter gun. Here is Ford in the red box with his fellow gunnery division officers. Some of them are chief petty officers. I can tell that by the hats they wear. Is anybody here in the Navy? Oh, good. I can say anything I want now. I mean, okay. Oops, that went a little quick. In mid-June 43, he attended a 2-week course on the quad 40 millimeter Bofors gun. And at the end of that, he was identified as instructor material, but he left back for the Monterey. He missed the commissioning ceremony. This is a little closer of is where his was at. Notice to the left and his right above, those are, there's at least one 20 millimeter Oerlikon gun. And I think in the tub right behind the gun is a fire director. Ford got along with his 12-man crew, but he did not like this assignment. He didn't like the grinding dullness of being in general quarters. That's when the ship goes on alert and is ready for combat. They sometimes were at the guns for 12 hours waiting for a possible attack. He wanted to be in the middle of the action more. And he requested and got a transfer. And he went to the navigation department. And the chief navigator was a commander. That's equivalent to an Army major, a man known as Pappy Atwood. He had been a civilian merchant mariner for 20 years. He taught Ford the fine points of being a navigator. He was very stern but fair. He checked all of Ford's calculations and generally saw some minor flaws in them. In the photograph, he's navigating according to the sextant. And if you look to the left of that picture, you see some hands. That's the enlisted sailor writing down his readings. Okay. Thing Ford really liked about his station was he was on the bridge, which is in the island on the left. He did his navigation work on the part of the bridge on the right. One of his jobs was he served as officer of the deck, which by definition is the officer on watch in charge of the entire ship. Now, the ship's captain does not stay on the bridge all the time. Oh yeah, I should say that the captain of aircraft carriers were aviators. The Navy felt strongly that if you're asking people to land on a ship, you want somebody in charge of the ship who knows what the problems are. So the captain has to make sure that when he's not up there, the officers that are in charge of the ship are reliable, and Ford was. Ford liked being in the middle of the action. This is a shot from the bridge. The Monterey has made a very sharp turn. I don't know if this is during actual combat or training. But he saw everything that you could possibly see, both, you know, going away and then coming forward. Okay, the carrier went from basically Philadelphia through the Panama Canal into the Pacific. And the flight operations were done whether they're in a combat zone or not. Frequent practice is needed back then and now on an aircraft carrier. Yeah, the planes are sighted on deck. It doesn't look like they're ready to go because their wings are folded. Aircraft carriers were manpower intensive. You notice on the left, the elevator is down to the hangar deck, and that Hellcat is being moved by seamen. You can also notice that the hangar deck had openings. Well, the reason for that is maintenance being performed on the aircraft, and they do have to turn on the engines and see if they're running properly, and you don't want the carbon monoxide exhaust poisoning everybody. When the ship is on or the aircraft is on the flight deck, they did have Fordson tractors, good Michigan product, sometimes helping to move the planes. You guys don't have any Fordsons, do you? No. No. Okay. That was a Fordson B-25 motor truck, repositioning a Hellcat. The bombers and sometimes Hellcats had to be bombed up, sometime in training, sometime for regular combat. Unfortunately, in this shot, since it's black and white, you can't tell that the ordnance crew is wearing red. The flight deck crew had colored jerseys or helmets to indicate what their jobs were. This pilot is preparing to board his Avenger. He is carrying a plotting board to help him with navigation. When they could do it, they like to fly off the aircraft on their own engines with no help. A little bit of meteorology. To help an aircraft get up, you wanted to have the ship going almost directly into the wind, not directly because you wanted to have the smoke to the side of the vessel. The wind helps give the aircraft lift, and they could fly off directly. In this shot, I'm going to have to go to the front. This aircraft has been catapulted off. How do I know that? Well, the caption told me, but they said pay attention to this sailor. He has on what's called the bridle that fit on the Hellcat. The bridle would help move the aircraft on a track right here, and then it would be stopped, and ideally the airplane would be catapulted off into the ocean. And most of the time, sometimes the plane, if it didn't have enough speed, would kind of dip down. You know, anybody see 30 Seconds Over Tokyo? You know, the B-25s kind of go down, all that. And that was the thing about that. They really didn't like to use the catapult because it was much slower. And, you know, in combat, you want to get your planes up as quickly as possible. There are some excellent videos on YouTube that could give you 50 minutes of how a plane is catapulted off on that. And these were hydraulic catapults. In carriers today, they are steam catapults, steam powered. And in the new Ford class carriers, they are electromagnetic. And don't ask me how those work either. Yeah, well, the catapults on ships on board, either the rear of the ship or on top of a turret, those were explosive charges for the seaplanes, because they really had to get those big clunky things up. Okay, so you know, taking off is one thing. Coming back down is an even bigger challenge. The ship is also going into the wind because you do need lift, because a successful carrier landing is that the plane is no longer flying, it is in a stall. And so you want to get that thing as slow as you can until you get ready for the aircraft to come down. And when the aircraft does hit the deck, there's a tail hook at the back of it, and it is supposed to snag a wire. The man in the foreground is another aviator helping the pilot land with his paddles, and that's his nickname, his paddles. You know, from his arm movements, he can tell the pilot whether he's coming in or not, and he could also wave off the plane if he's not really in what they call the groove sometime. In this case, we have a successful trap. The tail hook has hit the plane, or hit the wire. The sailor in the green circle, he is running to the plane to disengage the wire.
That's why I started.
Yeah. The red circle, that's where the landing signal officer, that's where paddles and assistants are. They are not on the flight deck. They are on a platform over the water. Better not be afraid of heights. And in the blue oval, those are planes circling in landing formation. The whole thing about carrier operations is carefully choreographed. You had to practice this. And then sometimes things would not go as planned. I don't know whether this was combat or training. Both the Army and the Navy losses through non-combat aerial operations almost equal the losses for combat. Military flying, as we learned from the Army at Fort Campbell this weekend, is a dangerous task. You know, it was true in the 40s, it's true now. Okay, when there's not air operations, people have maintenance to do. This is sailors working on the catapult on the left. It's a hydraulic catapult. You have formations on the flight deck sometime. The Navy purportedly had the best food of all the armed forces. And the submarine supposedly had the best. I think you could see it. Notice those coffee cups, they don't have handles. Why? Because the handles take up space in storage, and space is at a premium on a ship. You know, even if you have a canoe, you don't have a whole lot of space in it. When the ship is at general quarters, the cooks in the galley, they turn to making sandwiches. And sometimes the people would be at their general quarters or action stations hours on end. Sailor on the right has a knife, and most enlisted sailors worth their salts always carried a knife because they came in handy in a vessel that had a lot of lines. You need to cut through things in emergencies. Okay, it all wasn't work which made Jack a dull boy. You had diversions. The Monterey had regular movies, daily newspaper, a library, and they did intercom announcement of news, planned future operations, and when the planes were in combat, they broadcast to the ship on the intercom the pilot's comments. This photo shows the ship stopped, and they're having a pop-up swimming pool made out of ropes and nets. If they were in shark-infested waters, there would usually be a marksman, often from the Marine detachment, ready to shoot the sharks from having a sailor sandwich. Ford had a secondary task on the vessel. Almost all the officers had a number of different tasks. I think Ford had to censor his men's letters, but he was also the ship's athletic officer. And he excelled in that. He was lucky that both of the captains of the Monterey, when he was on it, supported his efforts. Here we see a boxing match, and I've blown this up, and in the red box, Ford is the only person in a chair. He is probably judging the match because he coached boxing. He was an innovator. He realized very quickly, if you're not having air operations, and there's no chance of it, you can lower the elevators and you would have some playing courts. The rear elevator had volleyball, and the front elevator was basketball.
Did all the ships do that, or just this
Well,
one?
the aircraft carriers did. Well, they could. I think Ford is the innovator in this because I will be reading his report to the Naval Aviation Training Command.
Okay.
So he didn't learn this when he was a Duke. Probably other people did it, but this photo is iconic. There are several publications the Navy printed in World War II, way before Ford was president, that had this shot of Ford. He's in the blue oval. Ford practiced what he preached. Notice there's fewer sailors watching the game. They probably didn't have as many bets on that one as in the previous one. I don't think it was all just, I want my guys to win. Okay. Ford reported back to the Naval Training Command that, quote, basketball is our best conditioning sport for the officers and men get more exercise in a shorter time. I don't know if the officers played enlisted men or if they played other officers. That could be tricky if you had like an officers team playing an enlisted team. Here's another shot. Ford is in the middle, and you can see the basket pretty well. And Ford continues in his report, quote, we play either 4 or 5 men on a team. 2 teams play for 8 minutes, then 2 more teams take the court, and then the first 2 return, and so on. Over a 2 or 3 hour period, a number of men get a fine workout. So the ship's captains thought this was good. I'm sure the people playing and then the people watching did. Now, the Monterey was lucky or unlucky, depending on your point of view, that they crossed the equator, because there is a centuries-old nautical tradition of crossing the line, crossing the equator, or it's sometimes called Neptune's Court, where the shellbacks, sailors who have already crossed the equator, initiate the polywogs, the sailors who have never crossed the equator, and it was probably similar to an incredibly harsh fraternity initiation rite. In this shot, a member of Neptune's court is putting something on the head of a polywog, most likely grease. There are other people waiting for their turn for one part of their initiation. And regardless of whether you were an officer or not, if you were a polywog, you got initiated. In this cartoon, King Neptune is welcoming Lieutenant Tucker. As you see, he has grease on his hair. And take a look at the grimace the sailor on the left has of Lieutenant Tucker. I think that sailor had issues with the lieutenant on that. And it looks like he's ready to give him a spanking, which was part of it. Of course, the fattest man on board was designated Neptune's baby, where there was various humiliations. I mean, each ship had a basic ceremony, but some were more than others. And back then, most people in the U.S. didn't go on ocean cruises, so you couldn't have got out of it by being on a cruise anyway. Going back on to diversions. The Monterey had 3 respites for going into Pearl Harbor. But they refitted in 3 anchorages. And these anchorages were chosen for their suitability for maintaining, sustaining the fleet, not for recreation. That's part of the fleet in that photo. But in this Anchorage, Ulithi, there was an island that they put for recreation. It was called Mogmog. And the fleet would send its sailors on overcrowded vessels to the island. And they got themselves some elbow room. They're off of a vessel which has thousands of your closest friends with you, has aviation fuel and other kind of aromas wafting around. So it's good to get some elbow room. You could go swimming, play volleyball, probably basketball, maybe baseball, just to go out and have some fun away from the ship. And of course, there was a beer garden where the sailors got 2 bottles of warm beer on that. Okay, that photo I showed you of the Anchorage showed the fleet. Not all of those vessels in that were warships. Most of the vessels in the Pacific Fleet were service vessels that supplied the fleet. Unlike every other Navy in the world, the U.S. Navy had its maintenance afloat, following the fleet, going into sheltered anchorages. And they provided mobile support for provisions, ammunition, and fuel. In the upper left-hand corner, you see the battleship South Dakota in a floating dry dock where they're doing maintenance on it. And then in the lower right, you have a fleet oiler refueling an aircraft carrier on the left and a destroyer on the right. This enabled the warships to stay afloat longer and more time to do their missions. Okay, at this point I was supposed to probably ask about time. I'm doing okay? Okay. All right, I am not going to tell you about all of their operations afloat. I'm just going to do one battle and then the Typhoon. But I'm going to give you basic strategy. All right, I'm not going to walk out. But you see that orange line. That's the extent of the Japanese conquest as of April 1942. And on the left of that orange left and above the orange line, those are the countries in Southeast Asia. They were European and American colonies that had the natural resources that Japan needed. Japan has only 2 things in abundance: people and a rocky landscape. I won't go any further from that. To the right side, where those red markings are, those are Japanese bases on islands. In April and May of '42, there were 2 major carrier battles where the Japanese lost a number of their carriers. So they had to rebuild their carrier fleet. But what they did, they sent the carriers' aircraft to these islands. And the Japanese strategy was their bases would be a barrier that the Americans would impale them on, is that their aircraft would whittle down any American fleet, and when the American fleet is whittled down, then the Japanese carriers, when they're finally ready, will come out and there will be a decisive battle. That's the Japanese strategy. Okay, the American strategy has 3 elements. That red oval, that indicates the Southwest Pacific Drive. It's basically along the big island of New Guinea, and it's commanded by Douglas and MacArthur. First he's in Australia, the pink country below, and then he's in New Guinea. And notice that that oval is going towards Australia, because what did Douglas Arthur say about Australia when he left it? I shall return. Okay, so he wants to go back. Now, in the middle, the blue oval, that is the Central Pacific Drive. That is skippered by Admiral Nimitz, and that's where the Navy's main effort is going to be. They did have a fleet supporting MacArthur, but the major one was the Central Pacific Drive. And then the map can't show the third component of the American strategy, which is submarines. By mid-1943, the Americans finally figured out that the torpedoes in the submarines were lousy. And I can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. But they finally put in more reliable torpedoes. And submarines really hit the Japanese sea lines of communications, both for raw materials, weapons going back and forth from Southeast Asia to Japan, Japan to its island bases. They really knocked the number on the Japanese. To give you an indication of how big this area is, the operational area is roughly equivalent to the size of the 48 lower states of the US. And to get there, you had to travel the two lengths of the lower 48. The Pacific is the biggest ocean in the world. It is huge. So that's why the Americans needed all those supply ships. Okay, the key weapon is something called the Fast Carrier Task Force. The Monterey was part of it. This force, depending on the time of the war, had 11 to 16 flat tops, starting with 700 planes going all the way up to 900 planes. By this time, 1943, the Navy had learned to effectively use the influx of fast carriers by combining them into the Fast Carrier Task Force. They were subdivided into task groups for flexibility. It capitalized on the strengths of having a bunch of carriers operate together. Here's what the task groups look like. There are 5 in this picture. The ones that are kind of in an inverted L, those are the carrier groups, task groups. They consist of ideally 4 carriers surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Those boats, as well as the carriers, had great anti-aircraft defenses on it. Ford's carrier for this battle is in the red box. That's where the Monterey is. And in the blue box, the battleships have left their carrier task groups into one that's battleships and destroyers. This is done for 2 reasons. The admiral running the fleet might think there will be a surface action at nighttime, so the battleships are there. And also, having the battleships out in front of the carriers, the Japanese will attack those first. And they would soak up the Japanese attackers and not hit the carriers. The carriers, by this time of the war, are the thing. It's not the battleships. Now, as a lot of you may know, sometimes the military likes to confuse things. The Fast Carrier Task Force had 2 names. If Admiral William Halsey, his nickname was Bull, the guy on the left, if he ran the Fast Carrier Task Force, it was named Task Force 38 and it was part of Halsey's 3rd Fleet. Now, if Admiral Electric Brain Spruance is commanding the fleet, it is named the 5th Fleet, and the carriers are known as Task Fleet Force 58. They are the same ships. Why did the Navy do this? Well, to confuse the Japanese. You really didn't need to. But I'll say Halsey is at sea with the 3rd Fleet. Spruance is in Pearl Harbor with Admiral Nimitz planning the next step in operations. Spruance goes afloat on whatever flagship he wants, then it becomes automatically the 5th Fleet. Okay, the American tactics. They would go into generally an atoll, which is a grouping of islands. The Japanese had major bases like Truk and Rabaul. They would first do a fighter sweep to gain air superiority. Okay, this is kind of the reverse of the first 2 years of the Pacific War. With Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had the most experienced aviators. They had a war in China, they had all this practice, and their planes were superior. They were lighter and could range farther, which was good in like scouting and hitting, say, the Americans first. The bad bit about the planes being lighter meant that they did not have armor and they did not have self-sealing fuel tanks. The self-sealing fuel tanks in the innards of it along the edges was rubber. And so if a bullet goes through that, the rubber will expand when the fuel goes into it and seal it off. Japanese planes, no. Goes into their fuel tanks, the fuel goes out, and these planes, the Japanese planes, if they were hit, were quickly torches. So the Americans gained air superiority both with the regular fighter planes that were on these islands and against, say, the carrier squadrons that came over to help them. You know, the carriers are still being rebuilt. Once the Americans have air superiority, then they bomb everything they can. And with this fleet logistical train, they called it, of the support ships, they could hang around and do a good job. In terms of going after the ships, that's the top priority. And within that priority, it's aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, patrol vessels, merchant vessels. They would hit infrastructure. Here's some bombs going on a building. And in this shot, we have this taxiway of an airstrip being attacked. Notice there's two planes on the side, which I think will be the next targets. Those are in the blue ovals. This fire on the shoreline, I think, is probably a fuel storage facility, given the heavy black smoke. And then this was the revelation to me when I was updating my talk, is that the Avengers had sea mines. And they would fly low and slow, escorted by Hellcats, and see where those arrows are on the map. Those are the entryway to the Palau archipelago. And they would drop the mines there. And so the Japanese ships inside the archipelago, that kind of light blue on the left, that's coral, so they couldn't get out that way. Palau has the island of Peleliu, which got a lot of attention in the HBO The Pacific series. So that's how we did it. A lot of admirals did not like the mine laying, but in this case, it was very effective. The Japanese didn't take this line down. They went out and attacked the American fleet. Here is a Jill torpedo bomber, close enough for a decent photograph from the Monterey. This shot shows a Japanese attacker on an American ship. I think it's the Monterey, but okay, the dark bursts on the left, those come from 5-inch guns. The Monterey doesn't have those, but on the other vessels they do. The slightly smaller black dots are the 40-millimeter Bofors projectiles. And then what looks like snowflake, those are the 20-millimeter guns from the Ehrlichons. And for every one of those snowflakes, there's about 4 to 5 rounds that are not treated to show up as tracers. So for every one of those little dots, there's 4 or 5 other bullets coming at you. The Japanese lost a lot of flyers and aircraft in these American attacks on the outer line of the Japanese offensive. I told you that on board the aircraft carrier, they piped in the pilot's radio communications. Here we have Captain Ingersoll. He's the skipper of the Monterey. He's in a ready room of a squadron, and he's very pleased that his bombers are coming back. Oh yes, the ready rooms for the pilots were probably the only air-conditioned parts on the ship. So it's not surprising to see the chief officer there. Comfy chairs. Okay. The battle I am emphasizing is the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which took place in June of '44. It remains the largest carrier battle in history. 15 U.S. carriers went out against 9 Japanese. The Japanese had restored its carrier fleet. They were ready to use them. Total number of warships in the fleet was 165 U.S., 50 Japanese. 900 U.S. planes against 700 Japanese. And the planes for the Japanese were both land and carrier based by this time. The Japanese strategy was to seize the Mariana Islands, which is in that yellow oval. They contain islands like Guam, Tinian, Saipan, Rota. And once we have those islands, which can have air bases, our B-29s can fly against where the Japanese homeland is, where it says Japanese Empire. So this was something that the Japanese had to maintain, and they were very optimistic that they could defeat the Americans here. Why? Their carriers are retrained, but the Americans, though, pilots are very much more trained than the Japanese. They have over 350 hours, a lot more for pilots who've seen combat. Japanese, due to all the supply difficulties they had, especially aviation fuel, they only had like 100 hours of training, maybe 3 months. But the Japanese thought that their planes, longer reach, you know, they could go scouting further, they could attack further from the Americans, they can hopefully stay out of the Americans' view. They could go out and then with their land-based comrades, hit the American ships, and they could go back and refuel. And the final advantage, and this was pretty critical, the prevailing winds go from left to right. So as the Japanese are attacking the Americans, they have that wind pushing their planes out as they get closer. And then when the planes come back to land, they also have the planes slowing, or have the wind slowing down the Japanese planes so they can make safe landings. The Americans, on the other hand, if they want to send out a strike against the Japanese, they have to turn around, go into the wind, and basically go away from the Japanese fleet, both for takeoff and landing. So the Japanese had 4 reasons to be optimistic that this will be the decisive battle. And this is part of the Japanese naval philosophy ever since the Japanese started having a fleet in the 1880s. In 1905, they had a decisive battle against the Russian fleet that they fought. And that's what they wanted to repeat. Okay, so the first day of the battle, the Japanese land-based attacks, then their carrier attacks, they tie up the American fleet. The American fleet does not go out and scout for the Japanese fleet. The Japanese are coming to them. And it is a slaughter of the Japanese planes. As I said, the pilots didn't have that much training, and that they torched when they were hit by American machine guns. The American fighters had 6 machine guns on them, 50 cal. I think we have 50 cal in the museum here. And so in this battle, the Japanese lost 300 planes. The Americans lost 29. It was known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Okay. By the end of the day, that's the status. The next day, both the American and Japanese fleet are looking for each other. And by about 3 o'clock, the U.S. fleet finally finds the Japanese fleet. So the Admiral Mitcher, who is commanding the carriers, he has to make a decision. And he decides to gamble. He says, we are going to go after the Japanese fleet, even though our planes are going to launch at 5:15. And he sends this message to all the squadrons, We're gonna launch everything we can and you guys are gonna recover at night. This is a chance to hit the Japanese fleet. And it's 300 miles one way from the American carriers to the Japanese carriers. So, the Americans get there at 6:40. There's a little time for coordinated attacks. The planes just attack who they want, and the US flyers have little practice in ocean open attacks. They've been attacking bases. And this carrier suffered a single bomb hit. In fact, the Japanese admiral thought that he had lost it, but he didn't. So the pilots, after kind of a dismal deal, they think they've sunk maybe 2 carriers and 2 oilers. And when they get back to the ship, fleet, Admiral Michener tells the fleet to turn its lights on so the carriers can do it. These planes are running on fumes. Some of them have to crash in the sea. They land at the first carrier they get to, whether they want to or not. Now, there's some controversy among historians. Some historians says this was a special deal that Admiral Michener did to turn on the lights. Other historians said, no, this was a common practice. So I'm not going to referee that controversy. This pilot's from the Monterey. He landed, and he is getting from the flight surgeon some medicinal alcohol on that. The legacy of this battle is that the Japanese have really lost their planes that were on the carriers, and they can't replace them. So in future battles, planes going against the American fleet are going to be suicide planes, the kamikazes. The Americans lost about 100 planes in this battle and about 50 pilots. One thing that helped in recovering pilots, not in this battle but other ones, was that the Navy, first of all, up in the left, they stationed submarines at certain areas that the pilots knew where to go if they knew their planes were hit and couldn't get back in time. And actually, George H.W. Bush was rescued by a submarine. They also had their scout float planes land and pick up aviators. And in this one, there are 9 pilots on that. A ship had to come and pick them up. Of course, the plane couldn't take off. Oh yeah, that plane's a Kingfisher. This photo shows a Monterey pilot using what's called a breeches buoy. This is how they transferred personnel at sea before helicopters. It was not a very dignified way of going across. You're basically put kind of in a sack and roped across. And the interesting thing about this is that the pilot, Burnett, won a Navy Cross. That's the second highest medal fighting man can get in action on the attack on the Japanese fleet in the Marianas fight. Okay, the Pacific Ocean, I think, is misnamed. It can be a very rough ocean, as these photos illustrate. And now we go up to Typhoon Cobra in December of '44. It is known popularly as Halsey's Typhoon. At this time, December, Admiral Halsey is now running the fleet. It is called the Third Fleet, so it's Task Force 38 for the carriers. What happens? Admiral Halsey was an incredibly aggressive warrior. He wanted to take the fight to the Japanese come what may. He is attacking Japanese bases and facilities in the Philippines and Taiwan. He wants to get another strike in. He misreads the weather reports and says, okay, I can do it. Well, unfortunately, that put the fleet in the Typhoon's path. Photo on the left is a destroyer. Front part is underwater. On the right is a fleet oiler. That's one of those big ships that was refueling the aircraft carrier. So it's a nasty storm. Okay, and now I have to go up. Ford, as I say in the slide, remembers this as being pure hell. Okay. When I start to talk, visualize the carriers being upright. He has the night watch, 4 hours, midnight to 4 in the morning. It's up here on the ship's island. He's officer of the deck. His shift is done. He goes down on the flight deck a little bit, goes down to his berth, hits his bunk, and then the general alarm comes out. Get back to your quarters. Okay, Ford cuts up, gets on the flight deck, which immediately tilts about 23 degrees, like that. He says he toboggans down the deck and he hits that ridge that I identified earlier. That broke his fall. He's agile enough to swing down to the catwalk, goes back inside the carrier, and then very carefully goes up to the island, where he finds out that the ships in the hangar, or the planes in the hangar deck are rolling along. They've broken their restraints, causing fires. Now, I told you that that cruiser hull made the ship a bit unstable, and that was really coming to haunt it now. The ventilation system was not putting adequate air into the engine and the boiler rooms. It was pumping smoke. The engine room crew had to evacuate. 3 of the boilers were shut down. If the 4th boiler is shut down, there is no pressure for the firefighting crew to put out the fires in the hangar deck. Captain Ingersoll is faced with a bad dilemma. He's might lose his ship. And do you want to be out in a lifeboat in a typhoon? Now, he consults with Commander Atwood, who had 20 years of seagoing experience. Atwood says, just stop the ship. Just let it roll. Ingersoll does that. The ship rolls, but it's not trying to fight the waves and everything. It rolls, but it's not as bad. And with that, the engine room crew can get back in, light up the boilers, and the damage control teams fight the fires, put the fires out. For the next 7 hours, the Monterey is in this storm. When things calm down, 3 crew are dead, 40 injured, 10 critically. The fleet loses 3 destroyers, 146 aircraft, 800 killed, 80 injured. And due to the damage, the Monterey is ordered, not just to the planes, but to the ship, is ordered for repairs in Bremerton, Washington. Ford, however, doesn't make this trip. He gets off in Saipan. Well, how come? Well, the Naval Aviation Training Division had a policy was that V5 instructors who are on sea duty can come back home, back to the States, after a year. Ford had spent 19 months on the Monterey, which was way more. So they go, okay, Jerry, you can go back home, go see your folks in Grand Rapids. So Jerry Ford, and the Monterey goes back to the fleet. Jerry Ford does not have to suffer the kamikaze threat. When he gets done with his leave, he goes to St. Mary's College in California, which had a pre-flight program, and he did his duties that he had at UNC. Then he is sent to the Naval Reserve Training Command in Glenview, Illinois, near Chicago. While he is there, in October of 45. The war is over. And the Naval Academy is playing the U of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in football. And gosh, some of those guys at Glenview, they were Naval Academy grads. We really like to see that game. And somebody gets the bright idea, let's have an inspection tour. And so these guys say, Jerry, you want to come with us? You know, Jerry's a football fan. Sure. And so they go in this Beech Expediter, which is the Navy's equivalent of a Beech 18. Has anybody been in a Beech 18? They're kind of cramped. But on the way to the airport, or there's a storm limiting the visibility. But the pilot really wants to deliver his crew to see the game. And, but he becomes confused. He lands on the wrong runway, which is shorter than the main one. He goes off the runway, down an embankment, into trees, and Ford and his comrades are lucky enough to get out of the plane before it bursts. So Ford's most dangerous time in the Navy was not in combat. It was either, trying to fight a typhoon or going to a football game. Okay, so he lives to tell about it. He goes down the road to Great Lakes Station, which is still in existence. This is the Navy boot camp now. He spends too much at a separation center and goes back to Grand Rapids. All right, summing up his time in the Navy. Wherever he was, he got good evaluation reports. He was lauded for his leadership ability. He was dependable, a quick learner, a good instructor. And I think his last evaluation report from Captain Ingersoll, he said, I was one of the finest officers I've ever seen. And now I want you to ponder something. A lot of people in World War II, yeah, they joined, but they really tried to get safe assignments. The Army and the Navy had letters from parents saying, oh, don't put my boy in the infantry. He's better, he can be a pencil pusher. Ford, on the other hand, he had many opportunities to avoid hard service. He was a lawyer. J. Edgar Hoover said FBI agents at this time have to be lawyers or accountants, to be special agents. And for the most part, special agents in World War II didn't get shot at. He could have stayed in Raleigh at UNC being an instructor. Given his evaluation reports, he probably could have lobbied to stay there, but he didn't. He wanted to have an active part in the war. And when he's on a ship, he goes, okay, this gunnery thing, yeah, it's necessary, but I really want to see what's going on. And he goes to navigation, which means he's in school again. It's one-on-one with a master navigator who is stern but fair. And he checked all of Ford's readings and always found fault with him. But he kept Ford on. Okay, kind of wrapping up. Post-war, Ford goes back to Grand Rapids. He marries Betty. He has a long congressional year, ending up as House Minority Leader. And he thought that was as far as it's going to go. He was actually thinking, oh, I got to buy a house in Grand Rapids because I'm, going to retire soon. Well, Richard Nixon makes him vice president, and then, in a way, Richard Nixon makes Ford president. And Ford, in his memoirs, says his time in the Navy gave him a great appreciation of how big the world was, how interrelated it was, different peoples. He said it gave him a very international perspective. All right, finally, if you go to the Jerry Ford Museum in Grand Rapids, you'll see a model of the USS Gerald R. Ford, which is the Navy's latest aircraft carrier. It is the first new design in 50 years. Oops, wrong one. It had a lengthy development. It began construction in 2005, was delivered and commissioned in 2017, 2 years late. It was first deployed last year. It has 23 new technologies, including that electromagnetic catapult. So I'm not surprised, the first of anything is usually, they've got to work out a lot of bugs. And it is not yet outfitted for the Navy's top fighter plane, the F-35. That will be done in the next refit they have. Now, some critics say that, okay, aircraft carriers, they are the old technology. Submarines could do the job much better. They're not as expensive. We don't need these big things. They're archaic. Okay. Since the Gulf War, military analysts, some of them have said, we don't need main battle tanks. They're too big. They're too expensive. The anti-tank weapons will zap them really quick. They're just not meant for today's battle scene. What are the Ukrainians screaming for? Main battle tanks. So, it's not my business to be a prophet, but I wouldn't count aircraft carriers out. Okay, it's question time. And thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
By the way, we have Arlington in the museum.
You have you do? Oh, good. It'll be good to see.
It was made here in Michigan.
Okay.
At Center.
Okay. I know that Oldsmobile made 20 millimeter rounds at the RE Olds Museum. You'll see all the ordnance that Olds made on that. Do you have a 20 millimeter round with it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And here's the ironic thing with the kamikazes. A 20 millimeter was not sufficient to stop a kamikaze. It was the 40 millimeter and the 5 inches. And this, since we didn't go into kamikaze, the 5-inch cannons, they had what they called the VT fuse. They had little radio receivers in it. And when the radio wave got close to a plane, it didn't have to hit the plane, it just had to get close to it. It would bounce a signal back to the shell and explode the shell. And that was a key bit of technology. Do we have any VT fuses here? No? No. So yeah, well, thanks. Knowing, I have no idea what Oerlikon means. I don't know if that's a person or a Swiss. It's not a German saying, is it? Yeah, it sounds Swiss German though. Yeah, probably is the name. And
Well, thank you.
okay, thank you. And oh yeah, I asked earlier for suggestions of a nice place to eat.